The scientific process of drug development, as agonizing as it is, exists because research through clinical trials ensures that drugs are safe and effective. For terminal cancer patients, waiting for the clinical trial process to run its course can be unbearable. In particular, because the development of cancer therapies takes an average of 8 years to pass clinical testing and be approved or rejected for use, terminal cancer patients rarely have the time to see these experimental therapies become widely available, let alone available through insurance. Rigorous inclusion and exclusion criteria can alienate people who would willingly participate in the research process. Consequently, and also because of the patient's great will to live, there are terminal cancer patients who believe they should have access to experimental agents that have passed initial safety testing without having to participate in clinical trials. Compassionate use, also known as expanded access, is a route by which terminally ill patients who are otherwise unable to obtain an experimental therapy and who have exhausted all other options can apply to the FDA to access investigational therapies outside of a clinical trial. These investigational therapies, however, have not yet been approved by the FDA and have not yet been proven to be safe and effective. As such, this is only considered in patients with serious or immediately life-threatening diseases, with no comparable or satisfactory therapeutic alternatives. Through compassionate use, physicians can apply to the FDA for compassionate use of experimental drugs for their patients, and patients must sign an informed consent document ensuring they are aware of potential risks. Despite the experimental status of these therapies, the duty of beneficence compels caretakers to seek some way to rescue the dying. The FDA approves the overwhelming majority of expanded access requests it receives, but even when the FDA approves a request, it cannot compel the company that produces the drug, the doctor and the patient wish to use, to provide the drug. But is such access really what we want? Patients enroll in clinical trials for a number of reasons. Some volunteer because they want to help advance medical knowledge. Others have exhausted all other treatment options and believe the trial offers the chance to get the best quality care for their disease. Current patients enrolled in clinical trials may benefit from experimental treatments, but that is not the primary goal of the research. Clinical trials require the participation of large numbers of volunteers and ample resources to ensure controlled, statistically sound, and well-documented testing, and follow carefully controlled protocols designed both to protect patients' health and to answer specific questions. The main societal purpose of clinical trials is to gain knowledge to develop better future therapies for others. There's a misconception among many patients, however, that the purpose of clinical trials is to benefit those who participate in the study. Patients and physicians confuse the testing of unproven drugs with treatment, as though they've already been proven effective. This is a major threat to the validity of informed consent in human medical research and has been called the therapeutic illusion. These are not miracle drugs. Experimental drugs can make a bad situation worse and only rarely have positive outcomes. Even if the drug works, the benefits might not amount to much. According to Arthur Kaplan, head of the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU, 2 or 3 out of hundreds see any benefit. Proponents may argue that it makes no difference if you're dying. Why not take a shot? But new drugs might kill you faster. New drugs might make you sicker. Side effects might be intolerable. There is no guarantee the drug will work. Expanded access programs could raise false hopes. Sometimes, the compassionate approach may be to deny access. Though some volunteers enter trials for altruistic purposes, others are more strongly motivated by the chance to improve their condition, or simply maintain hope, and this motivation would be lost with off-trial access. This is a large concern for drug makers. Why would people enroll in a clinical trial where they risk getting a placebo if there is a sure route to getting the real drug? Disappointed patients often paint pharmaceutical companies as evil, heartless corporations when they turn down compassionate use requests. But people at biotech companies must make emotionally and ethically difficult decisions when trying to balance an individual situation, as difficult and heart-wrenching as it is, against the company's obligation and ultimate goal to develop drugs for larger groups of patients and ensure that these products gain regulatory approval as quickly as possible. While you'll hear much about the one patient who isn't being granted access to a drug therapy, you're unlikely to hear much about the thousands of patients who might have to wait several more months to gain access to an FDA-approved drug. And you're probably not going to hear much about a company's manufacturing woes or financial problems at the same frequency on social media either. The FDA claims that it allows compassionate use or expanded access on the condition that the programs don't slow down clinical development of a medicine. But is this possible? If there were unlimited funds and ample amounts of the experimental drug, compassionate use might not present as great a hindrance to drug development, but this is not the case. Expanded access could damage the research process and negatively affect future patients and the greater society. The cost and staff resources necessary to administer compassionate use programs could exhaust a company's capabilities, a problem most evident in small biotechnology startups that do not yet have income. Also, there might not be enough drug to supply both existing trials and new trials, putting both clinical trial participants and those receiving compassionate use at risk. Manufacturing enough medicine for the hundreds of compassionate use requests that come in could be too expensive, especially when there is a chance the drug might never be approved. And diverting resources outside of trials could slow the approval process down. If such a drug is approved as safe and likely to extend survival or offer cure, these delays in drug development could deprive future patients of meaningful benefit from the drug. The risk of a bad outcome when taking drugs that have not received FDA approval is statistically extremely high. Experimental drugs may not be effective and could result in serious and unexpected side effects. In fact, you can die faster if there's an adverse reaction to a drug, and even if it does work, it might only add weeks or months to a patient's life. Almost by definition, however, patients eligible for compassionate use programs are in danger of dying. For the patients and their family members, access to experimental therapies can represent one last chance to fight against a disease or condition that will otherwise kill them or their loved one. Regardless, by letting products out of tightly controlled and heavily monitored environments, the product is potentially subject to incorrect use, which would still need to be reported to the FDA. Furthermore, patients seeking compassionate use are usually late in the disease when a cure is almost impossible. If the investigational therapy works, it may buy them a few months, but future patients who are early in their disease could potentially be cured if the therapy works and is able to complete the approval process. Anything that prevents this from occurring is a disservice to future patients. Many compassionate use requests are made for drugs that have only passed phase 1 testing. Drugs in this early phase of development may not only lack efficacy, but may be riskier than available data would show. Phase 1 trials try to determine dosing, document how a drug is metabolized and secreted, and identify acute side effects. Phase 1 testing has extremely small sample sizes, with toxicity and efficacy still largely undetermined. Only approximately 10% of cancer therapies that pass phase 1 testing are ever approved for use. Drugs in phase 3 testing may be proven not to work, even though phase 2 testing suggests it may be working. Only 6% of all cancer agents that enter the clinical trial phase are ever approved. In addition to the cost of paying for an investigational drug off trial, compassionate access disqualifies patients from hospice coverage, which might be the better choice for them. Is it right to incur these costs on a gamble? The principle of justice cannot be forgotten in examining compassionate use. From a fairness standpoint, throughout their lives, terminal cancer patients have benefited from research and the sacrifices made by research participants before them. So it is only fair that they contribute to the scientific system in return. Thus, if terminal cancer patients are not qualified for entry into a clinical trial, they should not be granted off-trial access, since this access would not serve others. The rights of terminal patients are simply the rights of individuals, and must be balanced against the equal rights of other non-terminal individuals who may, in the future, benefit from the uninterrupted completion of a clinical trial. The issue of who gets a drug and who doesn't raises questions of inequity in the system. People who are able to access these drugs must have knowledgeable doctors, resources, and contacts. And if they are turned down by a pharmaceutical company, they must have the time and know-how to work social media. What if you're not appealing or tech-savvy? Does that mean you deserve a treatment any less than someone who's more sympathetic to companies and public sentiment? The fight to obtain new medicines has taken to social media time and again. Patients whose stories are more appealing or who have more social media savvy may attract more attention than others with equal need. Arthur Caplan concedes that it isn't a fair system. It favors the people who know how to be noisy. Or people may use personal connections that others don't have. Is it ethical to say yes to one patient while saying no to the next? It has been argued that the program could not be designed in such a way that would make it fair, equitable, or compassionate, and greater effort should be exerted toward devising a better clinical trial system for more expeditious identification and approval of effective therapies. Others have also argued that altering the current methods of conducting clinical trials could ameliorate some of the issues involved with compassionate use. For example, the vast majority of clinical trials are conducted in metropolitan cities, and participants must be nearby. Funding to allow patients who don't live close to the trials to be able to participate, or expanding clinical trials into smaller communities to minimize the burden on patients, would allow for greater participation and more evidence of a drug's effects. There is also a problem with clinical trial programs that don't consider options for younger patients, but there are complicated issues with children that make studies in minors more difficult. Further, while placebo and standard of care controls are undeniably imperative to the study of experimental agents, and randomization creates clinical equipoise, terminal patients are seeking experimental options because they have already exhausted all conventional methods. Is it fair that the only opportunity they have to access these drugs is further limited by a 50-50 chance that they will not receive the experiment at all? Terminal patients who advocate for off-trial access to investigational therapies base their arguments on the concept of patient autonomy, a cornerstone of the rights-based ethical framework. Under this concept, a patient has a right to use one's own judgment about matters affecting one's life, without interference by others. Critics point to this at-risk population as potentially incapable of making a truly informed decision to take off-trial experimental therapies. People with terminal illness can often suffer from depression or distress that can cloud their judgment. The pushback to this, however, is that this question of informed decision-making only arises when patients make decisions that professionals disagree with. Furthermore, if these patients are considered to be competent enough to accept the use of Phase 1 and Phase 2 drugs in a research setting, why should they be deemed incompetent when requesting the use of the same agents in a non-research setting under the supervision of a physician? While patient autonomy is an important principle, there must be limits if that autonomy impacts others. For example, patient autonomy can infringe on caregiver autonomy when the patient asks for a treatment the clinician feels is not safe or effective, and thus not in the patient's best interest. While the principle of autonomy began as a negative right to allow patients to refuse treatment and avoid harm, it has expanded into a positive right to demand treatment. Another problem is that these treatment options are offered at a time when coercion is remarkably easy. What have you got to lose? Are you going to miss out on a potential cure? And worse, to families, are you going to let money stand between you and the chance to save your loved one? Compassionate use in the development of cancer drugs presents a moral dilemma, as we must try to find a balance between the needs and autonomous rights of current terminal cancer patients and the needs of future patients and the values of society. If we consider the issue from a rights-based viewpoint, the rights and dignity of the individual should never be sacrificed to the interests of the larger society, and compassionate access should be allowed. A more community-based viewpoint, however, looks toward a common good and focuses on the shared values, ideals, and goals of a community. From this standpoint, it would be morally wrong to grant patients access to experimental drugs outside of clinical trials. Several aspects of clinical trial methodology are set in place in order to optimize drug development for the benefit of future generations of cancer patients, but pose significant limitations to current patient participation. The clinical trial process must be advanced in a way that permits current patients their autonomous right to treat themselves as they and their physicians see fit, while ensuring that research is uncompromised. Furthermore, adverse events in compassionate use should not affect the approval of a therapy. Compassionate use programs could be expanded to include a more acceptable number of experimental drugs if they are employed in a way that furthers the scientific process instead of hindering it. Requiring patients who obtain compassionate off-trial access to enroll in a patient registry would allow for thorough data collection on the efficacy and toxicity of the drug. In fact, in the past, compassionate use programs were found to actually accelerate drug development because of the requirement that doctors collect information as systematically as in the trial protocol, a requirement that is no longer enforced. By altering treatment groups so that the focus is shifted toward a more targeted strategy, participation in clinical trials could be improved because more patients would meet eligibility criteria. The clinical trial process would be accelerated because of this increased participation, and more therapies could potentially be approved for the selected groups of patients in which they are effective. Patients who are seeking drugs under compassionate use will likely die without the therapy. But isn't being made to die faster, more miserably, or having death be prolonged with no increase in the quality of life considered a fate worse than death? This could be the fate of patients seeking experimental agents in an uncontrolled setting.